Yeah.
How did someone build a whole ornithopter cube
Dude, I put the link in the
and
channel.
not
go look at it.
include? I'm looking at it right now, and this idiot didn't put raid bombardment in the list, and I want to know what's wrong with him.
I might message.
How do you build?
That's a damn good question.
I might message them.
What happened?
I do love though that Ornithopter is the only creature in the deck, but you got Fling.
Right.
I want to see that happen.
I mean, there's shared animosity is right here.
Yeah,
you can fling a pretty big Ornithopter.
You got
that's true.
Fists
That's
of
true.
Flame and Tempered Steel and all that jazz.
Oh, I found Cavalcade of Calamity.
Say something into the microphone.
Something into the microphone. Good morning. Hello.
Great.
Greetings.
Ready to do it?
Yes.
All right, well, in that case, we are currently recording an episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy, and I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony Two Coffees Maddox.
Two coffees. Oh, I'm honest. I'm usually a 2-coffee person, but I've been trying to get back to being a one person coffee. But your wife just made me a second coffee, and it was delicious. So here I am.
Yeah. I, on the other hand, I have my Arnold Palmer Spindrift right here.
Cool.
And this is going to have me wired.
Yeah.
And it's got just like a little bit of black tea in it. Less caffeine than 2 ounces of coffee, it says right on it.
Okay, so we're not talking Panera Bread lemonade that kills you instantly level.
No, this is not the instant kill 100% lethality lemonade. I'm also stuffed. I'm going to try to edit out all the sniffles. I got bad allergies right now.
I'm so sorry.
Hopefully, no one listening can tell. But if you can, I'm sorry. We're going to try something a little new in the podcast today. This is something that some other podcasts I listen to do occasionally that I think works well. And we got a lot of requests for comment on this article that was making the rounds on Magic social media the other week, which is from the Defector website. The title is "The Creator of Magic the Gathering Knows Exactly Where It All Went Wrong" by Nick Zarz. Oh boy, Nick.
I knew this was going to be difficult.
Zarzaki. How can you know what? Let me do this.
I'm going to go Nick Zaricki, but Nick, I'm so sorry.
No, here's what we're gonna do.
Okay.
We have the power of the internet.
Oh no, we don't. The internet doesn't have any power left.
The internet's got power. Don't worry. According to the internet, it's pronounced Zarzicki. So, by Nick Zarzicki. This is an article that you have read twice now, you say, and I actually haven't gotten around to reading. It's been in my open tabs since people were talking about it last week, and I just haven't gotten to do it. So we'll get a combination of wizened perspective from you and first impressions from me. But we're going to read most of the article just on the air, so listeners can follow along even if you haven't read it. Though, of course, we will put a link in the show notes.
Yeah, I mean, I want to start even just with the title. I feel like that is...
I'm sure it's clickbait.
So much of what gets people's attention of it. Like, so much of the discussion ended up just being about the title, and I agree with you. It does feel like a clickbait title, but I think for a reason that's actually kind of interesting. The thing that I think stands out to me here is the word "it." So the creator of Magic knows where it all went wrong, and that just lets anybody put their own kind of frustrations into whatever this article is going to be about, and say like, oh, well, clearly this article is going to be about, the fact that my Tarmogoyf used to be worth $50 and now it's worth less. Or, Magic used to be fun to solve a new draft format, but now with 17 lands, you can't really do that. And so, like, it's really easy to put your own frustrations in there. So I think what's going to be interesting to actually tease out is what the creator of Magic is talking about, what Richard Garfield is frustrated about, is actually something that is not on, like, really any Magic player's radar. And I think it's actually something that is pretty interesting to tease apart.
My prediction for this article is we will see Richard Garfield being a total Chad. Which is to say,
absolutely.
Every time he talks about Magic publicly, it is so impressive how little he knows about Magic, given that, like, he created this thing that then became so many people's, like, whole lives, whether they're literally working for Magic and it's, like, actually is their whole job, or it is their primary hobby and they're so deeply invested in it, and he just is so gently aware of what's going on in modern Magic. It is inspiring.
I mean, I think he has a really healthy distance from it because he's got his own life and he's doing other stuff. And I think it would be really easy to, I shouldn't say something mean about Jonathan Frakes. It'd be really easy to be a Jonathan Frakes and just make your whole identity about that one cool wonder, that one hit that you had.
Is that what Jonathan Frakes did?
I think so.
More so than the other stars of Star Trek for whom I have no idea what they've done in the rest of their career?
Yeah. I mean, he just does the conference circuit and is always, he's Riker. And it's like, that's cool. Like, I respect that
I'm
character
aware of
a lot.
More things that Jonathan Frakes has done than I am Brent Spiner.
Yeah, okay, Brent Spiner's a better example.
Marina, whatever her name is. We got a long article to get to, so let's dive in. When they were still in art school in Seattle in the early 1990s, Jesper Meerfors and Sandra Everingham would sometimes look for inspiration by exploring Fort Worden, an abandoned 19th century military base at the entrance of the Puget Sound. To them, it felt like a dwarven ruin. One day they found a trapdoor hidden in the woods near the fort, which opened to reveal a rusty ladder leading to a series of underground bunkers filled with broken doors and graffiti. Meerfors snapped a portrait of Everingham as she stood near the base of the ladder, head limned by sunlight, and then forgot about it. Later, I was looking for some good lighting reference for hair, and I remembered the photo, so I took it out and started painting, said Meerfors. Before he knew it, he had produced the image called The Fallen, one of thousands of cards that populate the legendary deck-building game Magic the Gathering. That card still gives Meerfors the creeps 30 years later. It freaked me out a bit how easily it was created, almost as if it created itself. At the time, Meerfors and Everingham were doing a lot of work for Wizards of the Coast, a small fantasy role-playing games publisher. Their job was to create visuals for Magic, which Wizards co-founder Peter Adkinson started putting into production after meeting with Magic's designer, a mathematician named Richard Garfield from Portland, Oregon. Atkinson received a prototype of the game from Garfield, and when he started playing it in his basement, which served as Wizards' headquarters at the time, it grabbed hold of anyone who touched it. Even in its raw form, it created passion that boiled over into a hunger that could not be quenched. The world around us disappeared. By the end of that weekend, the game had us in its grips, wrote Wizards co-founder Steve Connard. So right away, this is what I think this is going to be about. My perspective on Magic is that Richard Garfield, in an attempt to design a great game, and succeeding in designing a great game, also accidentally succeeded in designing the most incredible consumer product ever invented. Like, basically a drug. Like, literally, we call it cardboard crack. The fact that this game, which has the idea of randomness in these boosters, and this, like, infinite deck-building possibility, and all these different ways to play, which is all things that benefit it as a game system, also, as a byproduct, make it this just machine of profit, which is dangerous. Like, anytime you have a consumer that has a hunger that could not be quenched for your product, you've done something kind of darkly powerful.
Yeah, I think that's it. I think you summed it up pretty well, and we're done here.
Is that really where we're going?
I think more or less. I mean, I think there's a lot more complexity and nuance to it, and sort of like interesting context, because Richard is such an interesting guy that has this weird aloofness that is like very unusual. But yeah, I mean, I think ultimately that's kind of where we're headed.
I must have experienced goosebumps because I had this visceral reaction, and I was hooked into these dreamlike possibilities. I felt the game was going to be huge, said Everingham. She was right. After Magic the Gathering debuted at Gen Con in 1993, 6 months of product sold out in 6 weeks. When Wizards ordered another print run from the printer in Belgium, Atkinson panicked as millions of dollars in booster boxes arrived on his front lawn, perched on pallets. When the company moved its offices into an industrial park in Tukwila a few months later, it grew from 7 employees to 100 in less than a year, at one point hiring 10 new employees a week to keep up with demand, including a large contingent of goths from the city's Vampire the Masquerade role-playing community. Okay, I didn't know that.
There's a lot of funny context. I mean, this vignette about this painting of the Fallen and, you know, exploring the literal dungeon of some abandoned building kind of like stands out from the rest of the article. Like, it feels a little bit disconnected, but I appreciate what Nick is trying to do here and sort of like weaving in a little bit of the context of what was the culture like of these people that were just sort of these like interesting creative people trying to do their own things, and they all kind of got swept up into this force of this game.
When the next edition of Gen Con opened its gates in August 1994, Magic had supplanted Dungeons & Dragons as the biggest thing in gaming. It's never really slowed down since then. Hasbro purchased Wizards of the Coast in 1999, and by 2023, Magic had become the company's first ever billion-dollar brand. Millions of people still play the game every year at kitchen tables, game stores, and professional tournaments. Among the thousands of people who have designed, illustrated, or played the game professionally since then, none are more famous than Garfield, who quietly left Wizards of the Coast shortly after the company was sold to Hasbro. Garfield is a Moses-like figure in Magic's history, a man who descended from the mountain carrying a game that would become an industry unto itself in his head, fully formed. It is not surprising that people who knew him and have worked with him refer to him as a genius, or that he is an enigmatic figure. Richard is probably far more intelligent than anyone I've ever met. I don't know what goes on in his head. A lot, I imagine, said Meerfors. Last year, Garfield gave an interview to VentureBeat, in which he seemed to lament what Magic has become. Ever since Magic was published, I've been trying to recapture something that I thought was lost after release, he told the magazine. When Magic was first designed, everyone had their own treasure collection, but those treasures became commodities, and we lost some of that magic. Pun intended, Richard? Pun intended? Since then, I've been trying to figure out how to get back to that. I reached out to Garfield because I wanted to know more about his apparent delusionment with the current state of the game he created. I ended up talking to Garfield for several hours, and I learned much more than I had planned about where magic came from. When I asked Garfield whether he'd be interested in meeting up for an interview, he gave me some surprising news. He, his wife, and 2 sons had moved to Australia during the pandemic. After he joined our first call 20 minutes late, he got distracted during his morning walk.
I can relate.
It quickly became clear to me that the only thing he was really interested in talking about was game design. I got his thoughts on Six Man Zonk, a Yahtzee-like game associated with the California counterculture that he used to play with his family. People don't think of Yahtzee as being a high-skill game, but it is, he said. If you're way behind or ahead, you should play differently, and games with high luck and high skill satisfy such a broad range of players, everybody can play them. Garfield loves to talk about luck in games, which he sees as a kind of social equalizer. If you head towards a game like chess, it becomes more difficult to find that person who gives you a good game, he said. Garfield works on games independently as a consultant these days and allows his academic and personal interests to dictate most of his designs. A decade ago, he remarried and found himself designing games his extended family, which included 2 children from his previous marriage, could play when they all got together.
I mean, the aloofness is really just incredible. It's like, hey, let me talk about this billion-dollar idea. And he's like, no, let's talk about Yahtzee.
We're talking about Six Man
People don't
Zonk.
really understand what Yahtzee's all about. And it's like, yeah, I don't get what Yahtzee is about. I would absolutely be in that category of people that think it's just a luck game, but the fact that there is this decision point in when you're placing bets and how you should make different decisions about your bets based on previous things. It's
Do you place bets in Yahtzee? I think
I guess so. I've never played Six Man Zonk, but this is exactly Richard's point, is that we don't really get this game and we're kind of making judgments about it without really understanding.
Yahtzee had sound off in the chat. I think the one decision point you have in Yahtzee is you get 2 rolls of 6 dice and you get to choose which number of dice you re-roll. And so I think he's basically saying that you should take higher risk, and instead of trying to aim for instead of aiming for a reasonably good roll, you should be riskier and re-roll more dice with the hopes of high rolling because you're way behind and you have to take a lead.
Maybe we should play some Six Man Zonk.
I mean, I'll give it a try. I'll try anything once. I have an introverted streak, he said, not paralyzingly so, and I certainly learned to deal with it. And games are a wonderful way to bridge different cultures, different ages, and different mental interests. And the more luck that's in a game, the broader that can go. The consultancy Garfield runs with former Magic designer Scaff Elias, 3 Donkeys LLC, has no employees, a dinky podcast, and almost no web presence.
Their website, I should say, is amazing. It's a perfect website. It loads quickly, it has all the information you need on it, and it's got 3 donkeys, so you know you're in the right place.
I mean, I'm just learning that Richard Garfield has a podcast? It's crazy I didn't know that.
I couldn't find the podcast, so I think it might be defunct.
Okay.
I tried pretty hard, but if somebody else has a link to that, I would love to listen to it.
I asked Garfield why, unlike other famous game designers like Shigeru Miyamoto, he doesn't run a larger company. I work well with other people in general, but when it comes to the designing itself, I like to be by myself and sort of tinker with things, he said. I don't work as well with people around the table. Going around the table is actually kind of painful for me because I don't feel like I can explore my thoughts as much, and I think that's something about the way my brain works. It's not at all that I don't appreciate other people's ideas, it's just that I can't come up with anything creative, or it's very hard. So my collaborations with other people work best when I'm doing the design alone, and then we get together later to talk about it.
Okay, Richard, this is a really funny definition of collaboration. The way he likes to collaborate is he's going to go away and do all the work alone and then come and present the work.
Everyone's going to go, wow, Richard,
wow, we did a great job together on this. Great collaboration.
I can see that a little more charitably.
I mean this with all respect because, obviously people work differently together, and there's obviously a lot more, he's going to go and do something, and then other people are going to riff on it and refine it and play test it. So it's not purely just that, but it is a little funny to see that as collaboration.
I mean, group dynamics are often dominated by things that are not productive for the shared task. I say this as somebody that has often,
a big truth,
for most of my life, been the loudest person in a room, in many places where I shouldn't have been the loudest person in the room. So I definitely recognize that, especially if you're a more introverted person and you're trying to pitch ideas, you pitch an idea differently to yourself for evaluation than you would to a room of people that you were trying to convince of something, or intentionally not trying to convince of something. Social dynamics changes the creative dynamic, I think, in a profound way.
Yeah, I mean, the creative process is often also, it's not about just I have this idea. It's about working through an idea, and some people can work through that idea in a conversation with somebody else. Some people really kind of just need to tinker with something independently so they can have something to actually present that is the focus, because, maybe the verbal communication of a half-baked idea is just harder for some people. So, yeah, I mean, I also have a lot of respect for the fact that he's saying here, I have this introverted streak, but I've learned to figure out ways to work with other people, and that, process is really important to sort of figure that out for each person that's trying to do a creative thing.
Garfield couldn't help but share with me a new game design he's excited about. It's a board game he began working on after reading Radical Markets, a 2018 book written by an economist from Microsoft and a lawyer from the University of Chicago who are interested in solving economic inequality. Okay, I already don't like these two people. I'm very, very skeptical of the economist from Microsoft and the lawyer from the University of Chicago who are interested in, quote, solving economic inequality. But that's maybe another conversation for another time.
Yeah.
Their solution? Create an economy where everything is always for sale and tax people based on the asking price to keep them honest. Okay, so yeah, I was completely right to be skeptical of these pieces of shit.
Hey, they're trying from their lofty academic position.
Law of the instrument, but you think you're supposed to save the world. It was exactly the kind of idea Garfield likes to interrogate with games, so he designed The Founders of Ravik, a board game about a planet where people are forced to constantly sell their assets. As I assembled the print-and-play prototype he sent me with a group of friends one evening, we were initially overwhelmed by the swarm of tokens, cards, dice, game pieces, playing boards, and instructions. As we started playing and the pieces started moving, however, we began to see the Radical Markets economy come to life. A kind of cat-and-mouse game set in as we found ourselves constantly resetting and meeting prices for territory on planet Ravik. By the end, we felt less like colonizers and more like an interplanetary speculators or financiers. Less invested in building life-supporting infrastructure than we were in always finding an angle or some unexploited value to leverage for victory points. It was like Monopoly for high-frequency traders. This actually is something that I think bothers proponents of the radical markets approach. Not enough for them to dislike the game, but enough for them to be a bit wary, said Garfield, who recently sent the prototype to a conference dedicated to popularizing the book's ideas. Growing more skeptical of these people as time goes on. Oh, a conference? A profit-making thing that's dedicated to advancing your ideas? Interesting. I think this economic approach would solve a lot of problems, but it will still be aggressively competitive, sometimes in different ways than vanilla capitalism. It's one of the reasons I like exercises like this. It reveals stuff you might be wrong about. I mean, I think I'm vindicated in Garfield being a total Chad so far.
Just showing up and being like,
talking about
you think
Yahtzee.
This is a cool economic policy. Let's actually figure out how this economic policy would play out in this sort of like microcosm. And it doesn't really play out like you expect.
Yeah, number one, sorry I was late to the call. I was on my morning walk.
I got distracted.
Which is more important than you. Number two, you want to talk about magic? Too bad. Here's some talk about Yahtzee. Number three, oh, you have this big fancy book and, conference series you've designed around this idea you think will solve social inequality. Allow me to simply design a game that proves you wrong. Utter Chad. Garfield takes game design as a means of understanding the world to mind-melting extremes. He's designed games to help himself understand complicated ideas since he was in high school, one of the most recent ones being a deck-building game about the Titus-Bode law, the physics equation that explains why the planets in our solar system are spaced out the way they are. I used Excel to play this. I don't recommend using real cards. The last run I made began with well over 1 million cards, and who knows how many additional cards were introduced during play, he wrote.
Casually... Obviously,
Chad,
people are going to read this and want to print out these millions of cards. However, I would not recommend that. And also, the casual, who knows how many additional cards I created.
Maybe a million more, I couldn't possibly say.
I mean, this is where I start really just loving Garfield's perspective, because we were talking a little bit 2 episodes ago on episode 200 about sort of like fiction and its value. And I think that I've been seeing recently this like really valuable parallel between fiction and games, that they sort of create this safe space to think through challenging or difficult ideas. And I think the Founders of Ravik is a really like interesting concrete example of like how would economic policies work. We can kind of simplify that down and basically like turn it into a math equation through games, but there's a really important thing that you wouldn't get from just looking at a math equation, which is human motivations behind those decision points, and you can learn something pretty concrete. And I feel like Monopoly is another great example where it was sort of created to give people an intuitive understanding of how the system of capitalism does not work. And it's, to anybody that's familiar with the story, very ironic how the game of Monopoly was sort of taken and functions today.
Actually, it's good.
But yeah, I mean, I think that this process of using games to learn about stuff is really, really cool and valuable, and I think also sort of shows kind of the limits of games, that we both kind of maybe are pretty invested in Magic to the point where it is a big part of our identity. But I really appreciate Richard's perspective on Magic was cool. I use it as a system to learn about something, to create some kind of experience, and then I moved on to something else. And having those limits to what is a small sandbox experience to learn about something is valuable, to place those limits and then actually apply that understanding to something bigger.
Yeah, it's a really cool way to move through the world. Do you feel like you have a thing that you use to understand the world like this?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who. I think maybe it was in the book Mindstorm. Somebody was talking about how they had some early experience with gears, and that sounds weird, but like gears was their thing. That was like the metaphor through which they saw everything is gears. I mean, yeah, it's like, oh, the fact that you can scale up power, scale up torque, or scale things down. It can become a metaphor through thinking about things. I'm sure I do, but now I can't grasp at what it is.
So what's everything for
moment.
you? Mushrooms?
Extinction. I think so much about extinction.
I draw pictures of things.
Draw pictures of things.
Both literally and in my head, and that's the only way I can understand things. I'm very visual.
Definitely drawing pictures helps.
Like any idea that can't be easily translated to a visual, I struggle to keep in my brain.
Yeah, I mean, in thinking about Magic, there are lots of like little lessons that I've learned that I've taken out of that. Like, I think for me, a big one was just that you can make the right choice and still lose, is something that I maybe would have said that I knew before playing a lot of Magic, but now I really, really like intuitively accept that, yeah, sometimes you're going to mulligan, and it would have been right to keep the hand in terms of that individual, like, what, there were the 2 lands you needed were on top of your deck, but it still would have been the wrong decision to have kept that hand. And I think that's just like one of many little things that I feel like you can gain from playing a game.
That is still one of my favorite things about Magic, and what makes it endlessly interesting. I played a bunch with Aaron last night. We just did some one-on-one cube drafts, and I got smoked. 6-1 in games, 3-0 in matches, and I tried drafting different types of strategies. We were like, trying different 2-player draft formats because Aaron had not done all of them before, so turned to some classics, did some new ones, and I really felt like I was just drawing terribly all night. And was I? Or did I draft poorly and build decks that weren't well positioned against Aaron's decks? Or did I make a bunch of play mistakes? It's so hard to know, and that hard to know is what makes the game interesting because it gives you a thing to think about and try and figure out.
Yeah, I mean, maybe another sort of like mental model that helps me a lot is honestly computer programming. I feel like learning programming really changed the way that I thought.
Yeah, for sure.
And in the same way that Garfield is talking about understanding this physics problem through making it into a game, there were a lot of like literal physics problems that I like made a computer game that involved gravity simulation, and just the process of going through and programming, like, how do I make these equations work and what is the result, and then actually being able to feel the nuances of how do you change one variable and see how things operate differently is an extremely powerful experience that I would not have been able to have if I just sat down in a classroom and somebody explained these equations to me.
That's probably a better answer.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry it took me a minute to get there.
No, I think for both of us, like, computer programming is a much better framework, I think, for how I understand the mechanics of things.
And I'm also, like, just being personal here, like, understanding the limitations of that more recently, where we're in a space where we're dealing with a lot of academics.
Social inequality with economics.
Sure.
Economics is a totally biased science, and I'd even call it a science is, I think, not fair.
Yeah, economics is complicated. But, coming to appreciate that, a lot of people don't think about things in this computer programming type way. And it's like, okay, you have more of a narrative and there's like some flexibility. And you're talking about the way these ideas are connected, but it's not in a rigorous mathematical sense. And that doesn't mean your model isn't useful. It just operates in a different way that I'm used to. So, yeah, I mean, I'm appreciating that different people have these different modes of understanding. And for Richard, games is that thing.
I think it's really important for everybody to recognize the limits of their own ways of thinking. Otherwise, you end up like these ding-dongs. Truly, I feel like...
You're so mad at these people.
I'm really mad at these ding-dongs. I feel like trying to solve social inequality with economics is like trying to cure disease with a broadsword. Like, yeah, you can interact with it, and maybe every once in a while you can do a crude appendectomy, but it's not the tool for the job. Garfield has apparently always been like this. As a kid, he had an uncanny knack for math and an incredible memory, and was sometimes so absorbed in thought he'd put the milk in the oven instead of the fridge. He wore his watch on his ankle so he could tell the time when he sat cross-legged. Most importantly, he really liked games. Okay, he's Manic Pixie Dream Garfield.
I always put the lids wrong. I'm like, I try and put the coffee thing on the... It's tough. Yeah.
I'll confess that whenever I hear this kind of anecdote about somebody who's like
so engrossed... Are you saying you do not put the milk in the oven?
I definitely don't, and I think it's a skill issue. You gotta try a little harder.
Wow.
Try a little harder, Richard, to put the milk at the right place. My flaw like this is I will often be looking for... I lose things around my house. I never actually lose anything. I misplace things temporarily around my home all the time, and I'll be staring right at it and just can't find it. And then my wife comes into the room and is like, here it is.
You gotta have workflow. For me, it's like I got my key bowl. Everything goes in the bowl when I come into the house, and it's there when I leave the house. If I don't have that, I would not function.
I mean, I have 4 places my wallet is 95% of the time.
Okay, yeah. I mean, you
There's
do
one of them on this pile of Magic cards.
He's not kidding. He's not kidding. When you say pile, it's
A loose pile.
it's loose.
An assemblage of Magic cards. You know that board game Stratego? We had Stratego, but we never played the game the same way. After a few times, the rules always changed. We created new pieces, or some of the pieces would have something taped over the front. Elizabeth Garfield, his younger sister, told me over the phone. We played a lot of games in the family growing up, but he's always been the person who takes a gathering or situation and tweaks it, in some almost mischievous way, to make it more fun, she said. The Garfields spent their childhood running around outdoors and exploring, but when Richard entered high school in the late 70s, Elizabeth watched a new game requiring a lot of indoor time called Dungeons & Dragons turn his interest in games into something more serious. I remember it becoming this thing where I was his little sister now, and he had those geeky gaming friends, and you would open the door to the bedroom and sitting there were 4 or 5 pretty smelly teenagers. I was probably playing less games with the group at that point, she said. Even among his D&D friends, however, Garfield could sense that he was different. While he fell in love with being dungeon masters and role-playing, he felt something deeper and stranger welling up inside of him. There was this feeling I had that games were this unexplored territory, that when you were playing games, you were genuinely discovering new things that were possible that hadn't been explored. Rather than falling in love with Dungeons & Dragons, I fell in love with games in general, he said. Garfield started playing and studying card games, war games, board games, dice games, chess, poker, bridge, hearts, any game he could get his hands on. When he came across a game he couldn't appreciate or understand, he would force himself to play it until he did. In his search for games, he also became attuned to the absence of games in things. I had some friends who were collecting science fiction and comic book trading cards, and they looked like treasures from afar, but they always left me a little cold because I wished that I could play a game with them. They felt like an empty promise to me, he said.
I feel this very much not with games, but just with, like, household objects. I love household objects that can also be somewhat functional, like ceramics. Having a cool vase that just, you can't actually put anything in is cool and it can look nice, but if you can also every once in a while pull that off and be like, oh, now I'm going to actually put a bouquet of flowers in this, or, I mean, I love cooking.
Ideally
so
something more functional,
have a beautiful bowl that also I'm going to pull off and, serve a dish in every once in a while, and that spark of functionality just makes an object so much more interesting to me.
In college, Garfield majored in mathematics, hoping a career in it might intersect with games. When he encountered something that wasn't a game, he would often try to make it into one. If you sat down with Richard in a restaurant, he would have the salt shakers and sugar packets arranged in a game before you knew it. Condiment chess or something like that. It wasn't just silly, it was fun, said Barry Reich, a software engineer who met Garfield in grad school at the University of Pennsylvania. One day, Garfield walked into the graduate lounge with a game no one had ever seen before. It was a card game, a bit like poker, if poker was deeply annoying and insane. Garfield called the game Magic because of its fantasy theme, but its defining characteristic was the spell it seemed to cast over anyone who touched it.
Okay, quote of the article, this is now how I'm introducing Magic to people. If they say, what is that game? I'm going to say, well, it's like poker if it was deeply annoying and insane.
Garfield had come up with the idea earlier that summer after meeting Atkinson, who told him he was looking for something portable people could play at conventions, a card game maybe. Garfield had never made a game with the intention of publishing it, but he had tinkered with card games for more than a decade by that point. After meeting with Atkinson, Garfield went for a hike near Multnomah Falls, a 500-foot column of water pouring through the Pacific rainforest close to his childhood home in Portland. There, a new idea washed over him. What if the variety and craziness in a card game didn't have to come from the same deck of cards? What if you could choose which cards you put in your deck? Or choose which pieces you use when playing any game for that matter, like chess? And what if, when you were bored with what you had, you could buy new game pieces from the store? In the distance, sirens. Foreboding. This is Chekhov's waterfall realization. I started whooping and hollering and yelling because I knew that moment that we had an idea that would add a whole new dimension to gaming, and if executed properly would make us millions, wrote Atkinson. I knew before I got to the end there that was for sure not going to be Richard Garfield saying
This is the turn. I mean, yeah, this is really sort of the climax of the article here, where it's like this moment of epiphany of realizing a new way to do things, and then you assume this is going to be, well, you didn't, but I think most people would assume this is the quote from Richard Garfield, who was just sort of the main character of the last paragraph, but in an uncharacteristic expression of enthusiasm. And it's no, this is the realization from the business guy that this can be a really effective product.
Yoink! It is mine now. I made this.
Oh no.
Wrote Atkinson on Usenet about the moment Garfield told him this idea. Garfield was at war with his own game and the industry that was erupting around it almost as soon as Magic was released. For the first year after the game came out, Wizards of the Coast made board games, role-playing games, party games, educational games, and every other kind of game, swept up in a desire to make games as big as the movies, as Atkinson put it. Wizards was also a, quote, big horny summer camp, suffused in a lumbering 90s earnestness and sex positivity, which sometimes jeopardized the company. Okay, that's the first I'm hearing of this.
Remember those goths. If there's a goth in the first act.
The vampire goths are here and they're horny. After Gen Con 94, for example, Atkinson and a group of employees played a game called Truth or Swill at an employee retreat, listing off who they had f***ed and wanted to f*** next, triggering an HR firestorm. There was the theater department at Wizards. It's really crazy what young people who get a lot of money and think that everything they do will be successful end up doing, is what Garfield had to say about his horror workplace in a 2017 interview. But even he wasn't immune to the experimental environment at Wizards. After Magic came out, he designed a single expansion for the game before quickly moving on to design new trading card games like Netrunner and Vampire. He also planned to make a sort of broader, easier version of Magic, a Pokemon, if you will, but got scooped by the actual creators of Pokemon who were obsessed with Magic when they were designing the original Game Boy and card game in the mid-90s. Okay, hold up, pause. I did not know that the makers of the Pokemon video game, the original iteration of Pokemon, were already playing Magic. I guess I kind of thought they were more contemporaneous. I don't know the actual year the first Pokemon Red and Blue came out. I'll have to go check. But then also, I thought Wizards designed the card game. That was the whole thing. They were hired to design the card game because they knew how to make card games, and the Pokemon company was like, design this for us, and then Wizards just did it. Am I wrong about that?
I don't remember. Okay, there might be some... We'll follow up next week when we look up this fact.
No, this is how editing works. I will put it in right now in the edit. Take it away, Editing Room Andy.
Hi there, it's Andy from the editing porch, because I'm on vacation, finishing the edit of the podcast. You know, it's actually very difficult to figure out the correct answer to this question, and it makes you appreciate how transparent Wizards of the Coast is with what goes on behind the scenes. But as best I can tell, the original Pokemon trading card game was designed in Japan by a Japanese company, and then Wizards of the Coast got the exclusive publishing rights in the US and also helped make a number of expansions for the game. As far as the video games go, the original Pokemon video games were released in 1996, which was, of course, after Magic, so they could have been influenced, as the article writer says, though I have found conflicting information online about just how long it was under development at Nintendo, with some dates going all the way back to 1989 or 1990. So, who's to say, I guess?
After the Truth or Swill fiasco forced Wizards to clean up its act and refocus on Magic, the company ran into another problem. Speculators had pounced on Magic, and they were making cards expensive and almost impossible to find in stores. Desperate to prevent the game from turning into something only rich old people could play, Garfield and Elias decided that the November 2024 expansion, Fallen Empires, would flood the market with hundreds of millions of cards. This worked, but the glut of cards threatened to swing the pendulum too far in the other direction and collapse the market for Magic cards altogether. And also, Fallen Empires was bad. The cards were bad.
I mean, there's so much interesting in this history, and I feel like it's valuable to have that perspective, because I think we think about a lot of these kinds of challenges with Magic as being very contemporary and part of the way that Hasbro has really sort of changed their strategy of producing the game. And it's interesting to sort of get this understanding that these challenges are actually just fundamental to a trading card game, and like hitting that balance of making it an ecosystem that works for collectors while not having speculators just abuse it to the point where it becomes inaccessible to players is fundamentally an issue, and that's it, and that's interesting.
Yeah, I like that they were conscious of and trying to solve this problem from the early days. It's kind of laughable in hindsight to be like, people are speculating on Black Lotuses and Time Walks. Let's print millions of copies of Thallid or Dwarven Armorer or whatever.
Hey, and you know what card's cool? Thallid.
I mean, yeah, there was like, what, High Tide and Hymn to Turok are like the playable cards from Fallen Empires.
And Ication Javelineer?
That's not actually playable. I mean, it's playable in Fallen Empires Limited, which we drafted once.
And it was something.
My deck was
I sure lost to Money Changers.
My deck was a 6 High Tide, 4 Homerid Deep Spawn deck.
Nice.
And it was bad.
I lost to Org. It's also interesting to sort of contrast, like, here's this game Richard has made. He's at the same, or in the future, thinking about games as a way to understand economics and the way that sort of human desires play out in groups, and Magic as a game is experiencing the same kind of thing. There's this like meta experience of what Magic is, and it's just complicated to have these contrasts of like what's happening in the fiction and then what's happening in the real world of the way this game hits the free market economy.
I often wonder, I am, as regular listeners will know, a vocal critic of free market capitalism and the profit incentive. But I often wonder if somehow Richard were able to design Magic such that it was just as good of a game, but not as good of a commodity, like just wasn't viable in the same sort of product sense, what sort of success the game would have had.
Well,
because I think substantially less.
Let me open up the curtain and show you Keyforge.
Is Keyforge that good of a game?
I've never played. I watched some people play, and I was like, you sure got a lot of little particles there.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible that there are other games that are I think Magic is the greatest game ever designed, and it's possible there are other games that are as good, but are just not good products, and so they don't have any of the marketing or force behind them.
I mean, I've heard from players of Netrunner that Netrunner is like Magic, but with a lot of these issues solved.
Well, gotta try to play Netrunner, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's the result of this, is we gotta play more games, including Netrunner and Six Man Zonk. Was that what it was called?
That was what called, yeah. There were other problems Garfield had to contend with. He began to realize that the individual games of Magic people played weren't as important as the larger game that emerged around them. The one people played when they traded cards with each other, came up with new strategies and decks, and developed reputations as competitors. This is what players refer to as Magic's metagame. Convinced that Magic couldn't survive by relying on its collectability alone, Garfield thought the metagame of sports, which made it socially acceptable to spend tens of thousands of hours on a game, might save it from becoming a fad. It's a little wild to me that he was worried about Magic becoming a fad at this point. Like, it was wildly successful beyond everyone's expectations.
That's how fads are. Fads start out fast and hot and wildly successful.
Yeah.
I totally get where he's coming from, and I also think it's very interesting to compare the parallel of Magic today, or Magic especially like 2 years ago, and trying to use esports as a model. And it's funny to think 30 years ago they were trying to do regular sports as a model.
Yeah, I mean,
it makes a lot of sense.
Magic used to be on ESPN 3 or whatever.
ESPN 8, the Ocho.
the Ocho. He and Elias ended up using professional tennis, with its glitzy tournaments, rankings, horse race, big fat winnings, and transcendent star system as a template for the Magic Pro Tour, which launched in 1996. It's easy to understand why Garfield left Wizards of the Coast a few years later. The entire history of the game sounds like a series of unending crises and social engineering experiments. But it goes even deeper than that. The more you look, the more you realize there was never a time when Garfield wasn't struggling to tame his creation. See, that's the feeling I've always had, is he was struggling to tame it, which is antithetical to me to the idea of worrying it's going to be a fad. Like, if you thought it was just a fad, you wouldn't spend all this time trying to, like, rein it in and, like, control it. You'd be like, well, it's going to run its course, and it'll be over in a little bit of time. Those things feel a little bit at odds to me. When Garfield first began working on the game, one concern replayed through his mind. If every card had wildly different effects, why would anyone ever want to play with ones that were obviously weaker? What would prevent some rich kid from simply buying 10 sets of the game and creating an unbeatable deck? The first step he took to solve this resulted in Magic's defining trait. He gave each card a cost. If you wanted to play a card that was obviously more powerful, you'd have to pay more for it, in the form of a non-renewable magic energy source called mana, which you generated by tapping any land cards you had in play. In the same way a weekly paycheck might determine the parameters of your economic life, the amount of mana you generate every turn in Magic constrained what you could do. As you played more lands, maximum 1 per turn, and your mana income increased, you could play more expensive creatures and spells every turn. Small sidebar, I do love when people are trying to explain Magic to, like, the broadest possible audience. It's just interesting to... It's like reading the Wikipedia page for a color. You ever read the Wikipedia page for, like, orange?
I'll get back to you on that.
It's pretty fun.
I think this is a pretty good attempt. I've read plenty of such explanations, and they can often be bad.
As the number of cards in circulation grew, Garfield went out of his way to keep common or easier to find cards powerful, while also keeping the rare cards narrowly attuned and never so powerful that you needed them to win. He would sometimes demonstrate this by bringing a deck full of common cards to game stores and beating players who had decks stuffed with expensive rares. Today, getting rich kids to buy 10 sets of the game seems to be Hasbro's primary business model. Wizards has adopted a punishing release schedule, printing so many new cards that the Bank of America recently reprimanded Hasbro for trying to over-monetize their players and downgraded the company's stock. When I asked Garfield what he thought about this, he pleaded ignorance and told me he's been completely disconnected from the game since the pandemic. He's heard rumors that have alarmed him, but he thinks Wizards of the Coast old-timers like Bill Rose and Mark Rosewater still have the game's best interests at heart.
Here's the big Chad energy you were looking for.
Chad behavior. Sorry, can't be bothered to follow that billion-dollar thing I created. I've been over here playing six-man Zonk and going on walks. Is this the right time to talk a little bit about the dichotomy between Mark Rosewater and Richard Garfield?
Sure.
I think overall in this podcast, we are fans of Mark Rosewater.
I think this is a pro Mark Rosewater podcast.
This is a pro Mark Rosewater podcast. And to me, I think the dichotomy between Mark Rosewater and Richard Garfield and how they relate to the game, putting aside the fact that Richard Garfield's kind of disconnected, but the way they relate
that
to...
seems like a big part of his thing.
Well, so I guess not putting it aside, it's this like kind of fundamental difference of like how people, I think, approach the world's problems. And some are like, we're going to solve it within the system. Like, I think Mark Rosewater is keenly aware of all the problems that Richard Garfield is aware of, that you and I talk about all the time, and is trying to solve them in a compromising way with the brass at Hasbro, and like trying to play politics and thread this needle of like trying to keep Magic a good game in spite of all of the forces that are trying to suck it dry of every ounce of value and just turn it into a cash cow. Whereas Richard Garfield's like, yeah, that's what's going to happen, and you can stay and, you know, try and fight the good fight, or you can just go play six-man Zonk.
I think it would be really helpful for me to understand this dichotomy if we could make a game out of it, and so you could play as either Richard Garfield or Mark Rosewater, and you each have maybe a different set of powers and abilities. This is going to be great. I'll workshop it.
I'll play it. You just got to design it. But I think, you know, Mark Rosewater gets a ton of flack publicly, which I don't know how he puts up with it, to be perfectly honest. Like,
that's his... Talk about special abilities. That man has
is
a superpower.
So in the public eye and produces so much stuff, articles, podcasts. I mean, he's made thousands of episodes of Drive to Work, written thousands of articles, probably tens of thousands of articles by this point. And I think a big part of why he gets so much flack in public is because people often sense a like disconnect between what he is saying is valued and what the actions of Wizards of the Coast seem to evidence as their values.
I mean, he also gets so much flack just because he's willing to put himself out there and be a public face, and it's hard to be angry at a corporation, like to focus your anger. So just when he says, hey, I'm an individual human being, like you can relate to me on a human level, and people have a lot of anger, it's going to come at him, which is unfortunate. And again, it's like, it's bold that he does it, and I'm impressed that he's able to.
There's a really great Patrice O'Neill joke, rest in peace Patrice, where he says that what would be the best thing for healing the racial divide in America would be having one guy they could blame for racism. He's like the problem is...
Oh, so like Christianity. You want just one guy to put all the sins on.
He's like, the problem is, we look around, we see white people, and it's like, it's a little bit your fault. If we have one guy, like Hitler or whatever, that we could just be like, that guy, we hate that guy, it would be so much easier for everybody.
I say something about the Holocaust, about black people and the Holocaust and the Holocaust. If black people had one face to call the leader of race, like of slavery, like, cause it's too broad. We just hate too many of you. If you just made like one dude with a funny mustache and a big bite, like he was the dude that made slavery, we'll be like, all right, we hate him, and then we can move on. Yeah. That's very smart. I'm telling you.
Yeah, I don't know if it would be easier, but it wouldn't be more correct. Like, it is a little bit all our faults.
He's a comedian, Anthony. He's not actually trying. He knows that he's a comedian. He's in his lane.
That's
he's not trying to
his way of understanding stuff is comedy.
Yes, exactly. The places I get worried about are Magic's tournament system, which has historically been important to Magic's health, and then the philosophy that you should not make rare cards so powerful that you need them. People feel that's a philosophy that has been broken from time to time, and I think it's always been a mistake. It might have made more money in the short run, but it has hurt the game in the long run, or at least until it was corrected, he said. I think things that are existential threats for a game like Magic is if the community breaks down, and here I'm thinking of the community built around tournaments, but not just that. Or if people see it as being a game where you can buy a victory, which is associated with this idea of making rare cards too powerful. Or powerful cards too rare would be another way to put it. Those are serious problems which might lead to short-term profit but will lead to long-term problems that could be catastrophic. After speaking with Garfield, I decided to visit the most important Magic community I knew, Greyhaven Hobbies and Games, the small hobby store down the street from where I grew up in White Rock, British Columbia. I didn't actually play Magic much as a kid. I didn't have enough patience for the rules, and I was always too shy to ask people to play, but that never stopped me from regularly camping out and staring at the art in the 10-cent box at Greyhaven, where owner Adam McCormick cultivated a super chill, zero-pressure environment that I have yet to see replicated at any other store. Nick, come on down to No and Beyond in Baltimore, Maryland, and play Cube with us. Genuine invitation. Before returning to Greyhaven, I visited a bunch of other game stores where I noticed not only that all the 10-cent boxes were gone, but also their entire stock was locked away in cabinets. When I asked the clerks whether I could look at their cards, they told me to check their website, and one shopkeeper even looked at me like I had just threatened to murder his family. I have totally noticed that, said McCormick when I asked him about the cabinets of locked away cards. I've had some customers in the last year who would come in because I have binders full of singles. They would come in, sit down, have a coffee, and look through the binders, and they thought that was really vintage, really rare. Looking through the Magic binders was like looking through the daily newspaper. You'd find singles you'd never seen before, and maybe you'd buy them. Today, there are more than 3,300 cards in Standard, the format of Magic you play at tournaments to keep up with if you want to be on the cutting edge of the game. Each card features enough rules text to fill an AP Wire story. Get the wasted thing in here. More weird keywords and mechanics to keep track of than ever, and the artwork looks like it belongs in a movie poster, not a 2.3-inch by 1.8-inch art box. While visiting with McCormick, he told me he was winding things down after 30 years in business. Magic had been responsible for a big, reliable chunk of his revenue since the early 90s, but that started to change 3 years ago, when he says it started to get difficult for him to acquire product. They would make these special releases, and it was stuff you knew you could sell, but you couldn't get. The Secret Lair set started coming out. That's a specific product they only sell themselves and don't give to stores. They also started selling booster boxes on Amazon, he told me. They don't owe me anything, but you could just consciously feel that they were trying to cut you out. They wanted people to stop playing the game in stores, to tank Standard, and for people to play on Arena. For the first sentence of that quote, I thought Adam was going to have the most reasonable take ever, and then the second sentence of, actually, they wanted people to stop playing in stores and they wanted to tank Standard.
What do you think the reasonable take would be?
I mean, they don't owe me anything, but you could feel they were trying to cut you out. Like, yeah, I think that's reasonable. That's true. That's the problem. The problem is they don't owe you anything. It's true, but it's also the problem because their only actual allegiance is to profit, because that's what it means to be a corporation under capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I agree they wanted people to stop playing in stores, but they did put a lot of emphasis on getting people to play Arena, and maybe there's just not enough space for both of those to happen.
Yeah, I don't know. We don't play Arena, either of us, and
yeah, it's been a long time since I opened it up.
You played it a little bit during the pandemic, but I played I did the tutorial and played one game and was like, nah, this is not for me. We've said before, but I like this game because I get to play in person with friends.
Yeah. I
stare at a computer screen all the time. I don't need to do that for my actual hobby as well. But I really love that Arena exists, broadly speaking, because there are a lot of people just in my life that I know that play Magic only because they can on Arena. People with kids that can't get away for 3 hours to come to a Cube draft, but, after they put their kid to bed, they can spend 30 minutes playing Magic on their phone. I'm glad Magic is accessible to those people, and we've also talked at length about the design considerations that have affected things related to digital play and stuff like that. There's a lot of downsides, but I want to say for the record that overall, I'm really glad Arena exists, and I think it's good for the game, broadly speaking.
I don't know if I totally agree with that, but I will just counter the next thing that's about to be said, which is that I think as far as software goes, Arena's pretty stable and pretty good. I have lots of complaints about the state of software in this day and age, and Arena's not that bad.
Anthony's reading ahead. Here we go. Arena is Magic's online platform, a janky piece of software that I haven't been able to close a single time without opening my task manager and force quitting. To use Arena is to encounter an infernal procession of undersized text, slot machine-like animations, and in-game purchases that highlight all of Magic's worst qualities.
No, now that I hear it again, actually I agree with that.
I mean, that's completely true.
The software is itself janky, but it's trying to do so much, and yeah, the text is small and there's too many animations, and I feel old looking at it.
I mean, I think that's all true. The software is bad. All software is bad now. And we can have a whole podcast about that. If we ever start a Patreon, it's just going to be us talking about things that are not Magic at all for 30 minutes unedited. And the first episode could be about how all software is utter shit now. And yeah, I hate all those aspects of Arena, but I'm still glad it exists, right? All the decisions that are being made about it are being made for the wrong reasons, but it's still a thing that allows people to actually play the game, which I think is fine. Arena feels an awful lot like what Garfield calls Skinnerware, a relatively recent phenomenon in game design wherein publishers, usually of electronic online freemium games, abuse and essentially treat their users like animals in a test chamber. But the real problem with Arena is that it just doesn't feel like real Magic, because Magic is a game made for face-to-face play with another person. Big +1 to the Skinnerware nonsense. And I think that's what literally everything feels like now. Like, it's almost sad that I accept that that's what Arena is, because I accept that's what everything is. Like, it's just not.
What is Skinnerware? I can only find links to Facebook articles, which are, talk about the state of software. It's like literally every platform is broken, and it's just like weird embeds that have broken links.
Just taking it as the definition given here, because yeah, it links to a Facebook post, which I don't know why you would ever do that. And also Facebook makes it impossible to link to things.
Yep.
When Garfield was first designing Magic, he included mana-generating lands, creatures that you could attack and defend with, and sorceries and enchantments you could cast on your turn. He also included a fifth type of card called Instants, which you could play anytime, even during your opponent's turn, often to interrupt something they were doing. This was great for Magic because it made players feel like they were always playing the game. It also posed a problem to anyone interested in making a computer game out of Magic because Instants relied on the social and biological reality of a face-to-face encounter with another human being. When you're playing across the table from someone and you make a play, you know that technically they get to interrupt. So if you're looking at their face, you can notice them pause, and then you pause. And then they can say that they're interrupting. All of that is very easy to negotiate in person, Elias told me. There's a colossal amount of data and evolution that goes into people's facial expressions, and reading them in social situations is not an easy thing to duplicate. That's what makes the interruption response in Magic work in real life. And when you try and translate that to a computer game, it's hard, because you have a lot of is this okay? Is this okay? Is this okay? This explains the shuddering, halting sensation of playing Magic in Arena, where the only permitted form of communication between players is a series of predetermined phrases like, hello, your go, and good game. That's a really concise way of actually describing a lot of the challenge with porting Magic to digital play, which I never really thought about.
Definitely.
Instants and the stack are fundamental to the game, and also shortcutting through all of that is what makes Magic playable in person, and that really is probably one of the biggest challenges of actually digitizing it.
Right, and I think that that's going to be difficult for a lot of very invested Magic players to accept, because they will say oh, if I'm expressing something, I'm I'm expressing a tell, I'm giving something away, and we should be very precise about communicating every step and phase in order to play at this high level. But that's honestly just not where most people are, and the fact that sometimes you're just yep, I'm tapping all my lands, I'm putting my hand face down, take your turn, is what makes it work so much better. I think the degree to which often we just express the fact that we don't have a response in casual gameplay is huge.
Even putting that aside, right? Just the idea that you take actions at a certain pace in human play, you wouldn't be tap, 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 play, pass. You wouldn't just say all of that quickly. But if you were playing digitally and things were just automatically progressing, as you didn't take actions, that's how fast your turn would be.
Yeah, and
there's also no accommodation for just a response in a human amount of time. Even if you're not giving anything away, you're playing full Reed Duke, zombie, you still have a second and a half, 2 seconds after your opponent makes a play to say something, to show some face before they do something else. They're not just going to plow right through. And that you just can't program that. You can't program, give the person on the other side of the computer 2 seconds to press the I have a response button, and if they miss it, then they're screwed. The only way you can program it is this really structured back and forth.
And the whole shortcutting mechanism of Magic, I think, is something that it's so natural and we take it for granted that it just makes sense. It just feels like the way it should work. But it's actually pretty cool if you think about it formally, the fact that if I just play a land and say go, I'm proposing a shortcut, and then my opponent has
through a lot of stuff.
The opportunity to say, actually, I would like to stop you at the beginning of combat step, because I want to, do something that would force you to use your mana such that I can do something else in your second main phase. And that's all legal according to the rules of paper play, and is how the game works, and is really important, and allows a lot of stuff to happen in the game, and it's really, really, really hard to recreate that in a digital experience.
And to be fair, it's also really complicated in the paper rules. It's not complicated there to formalize that in the, comprehensive rules of the game, but the actual play experience of it is very natural.
Right.
Garfield and Elias apparently predicted this, and in the mid-2000s actually offered to redesign Magic to make it more suitable for online play, but Hasbro turned them down. In fact, shortly after Hasbro purchased Wizards in 1999, they barred Garfield from developing any computer games that weren't directly connected to Magic, which he says is the main reason why he left the company. Hasbro doing corporate stuff. Yeah, you're not allowed to be a person with creative output anymore.
Yeah, that does sound rough. I mean, it's funny how they were, I guess, really... It was important to them that it be one cohesive game and Magic on Arena be the same game, but then they also went and didn't do that and it made Alchemy, and I think maybe that kind of proves that they were right about the importance of Magic being a cohesive game, because
So interesting to think about them redesigning Magic.
It's confusing.
This is, I mean, I've said before, I didn't even know this is the thing they proposed, but I think I've said before when we were talking about Arena that what I wish they had done is just been like, new game. Here's a new thing that is maybe even shares like storylines with Magic. It can share characters. Maybe some cards do just work, but like it is a new and separate game that you play on the computer.
Okay, but there are a lot of other new and separate games you can play on the computer, and
Hearthstone is hugely popular.
Did you ever play Hearthstone?
No, but I also don't play digital Magic.
Because it's Magic, you tried it.
I mean, I would have tried the thing that was
no, it isn't, because you didn't try Hearthstone.
But that is quite literally different mechanically, like.
But that's what you're suggesting. Make a game that is a new game that works better.
There are some things that you could definitely have it be much more related to Magic than Hearthstone is and still have it work.
I don't know. Hearthstone looks pretty related to Magic.
I mean, more so than they would probably want to admit. As my conversations with Garfield continued, I came to a realization. I had misinterpreted the quote he gave to VentureBeat about his cards being turned into commodities and the game losing its magic. What I didn't realize until speaking with him was that the earlier, non-Ruin version of Magic he was talking about was the pre-publication playtest version he had debuted at UPenn in 1991.
All right, we finally found what it is.
This is, I mean, I've said it many times throughout this podcast, but this is the peak of Chad Mountain, I'm sure. The best version of Magic was actually the version I played in the UPenn library that I've never released because it got changed before we actually made Alpha. Incredible. I'm going to actually make a prediction here. I think where this is going is something I've said in the past, which I think maybe we can talk about more in detail at some point, is I think there's an attribute of Magic, which is that it, like described in this article, creates a hunger in you. It, for a lot of people, becomes this vast, interesting world they are compelled to explore and learn more about. But I also kind of think that Magic is more fun when you are less invested. And so it's this paradoxical thing where you want to get more invested because it's amazing and incredible, and everything you learn, you just uncover more things to discover and combine. But I think Magic is at its best when you are naively playing kitchen table decks with, other people that are in the same strata of naivete about the game, and you just kind of have whatever cards you have, and you're like mushing things together. And as soon as you start optimizing it, which you desperately want to do, you want to optimize it because the game is a puzzle that's laid out before you, and you want to try and solve. That's what playing Magic is. But the more you solve it, the more it becomes not as fun.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the optimizing process, that learning, that journey is the fun part, and once it is optimized, that journey is a resource that's consumed. It doesn't exist anymore.
Well, it's not like the game is fully optimized. I mean, like,
of course, like it's more asymptotic. Like, compare it to tic-tac-toe. It's fun when you don't understand that tic-tac-toe is a solvable problem, and as soon as you realize there is a dominant strategy, you're no longer playing a game and you're just acting through a system, and tic-tac-toe is 100% optimizable. Magic, much less so, but you're still, like, approaching that 90% of optimization.
Yeah, I mean, even just the joy of, like, discovering a new card you didn't know existed, which that's definitely, like, the frequency with which that happens for me. When I first got into the game, it was happening every day with dozens or hundreds of cards because I was just trolling Scryfall, like... Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, when I first got into the game, I was a kid, and I would see new cards that I'd never seen before, and there was no real way digitally to, like, go and look at lists of all the cards. It didn't exist, and that was the best. And obviously, we can't have that in the world of the internet. It's just incompatible. And, there are some days where I'm like, get rid of the internet and let's have Magic in its original form. But over time, maybe now I see a card I've never seen before and think is fascinating, like, once every 3 months, right?
I mean, I think it's, ironically for me, now there would be a ton of cards that would surprise me because I've just been...
They'd be new cards.
Keep up with the new cards. But yeah, I mean, if you talk to me in 2019, 2020... I was pretty good at the art game. Let's put it that way. You could show me a picture of a Magic card and I could probably tell you roughly its rules text.
I think the biggest change and misunderstanding about the game was how many cards people were going to play with, he told me. When we were playing the playtest, I gave each person a single deck and then later on maybe one more deck. Very late, in what I called the rich environment, I gave them 4 decks to see how crazy it would be. And that was just not the way the game was played. When you first start out playing Magic, when you're playing with kids at the schoolyard or around the kitchen table with cards your older brother played with, that is the way it works. Your friend will have a card you don't have. But when you enter the store system, then that's no longer the way it works. You just get many, many more cards to the point where the magical aspect of having unique cards which nobody else has goes away. I predicted correctly. Kind of.
Congratulations.
This wasn't just nostalgia talking. There seems to be something objectively more magical, more infinite seeming, and treasurable about the smaller, more limited version of Magic. But wasn't the idea of deck construction the epiphany that Garfield had at Multnomah Falls? That you should be able to choose any card and put it in your deck? It wasn't that you should be able to choose any card that was printed, it was any card that's available. I was not picturing that you get the thing you wanted from the store, and I was not thinking that anybody would ever purchase an entire box of boosters or anything like that.
So here is what I think is really the crux of the article, and what is really important here is that there was this really big difference between the pre-release game, where Richard Garfield was fully in control of not only the game, but he was also in control of the metagame. He was in control of the game about the game, the way that people were trading cards, what cards people had access to. He was fully like the GM for this experience.
You just take some cards out of someone's deck, throw them in the paper shredder. Sorry, the card's
Sure.
too good, it's gone now.
And then as soon as it was released, he no longer had that control, and he was not designing both the game and the metagame. The metagame was now fully subsumed within this other system, which is, I mean, if we're honest, it's subsumed with or become the same thing as the free market, that people can just go and buy whatever they want. And I think for Richard, it was really important that that metagame was an experience that he designed, and the structure of the way people could exchange and trade cards and have access to cards created a fun experience that is just not possible to have when you replace that metagame with full free access to whatever. Also, I think this is something that he has tried to recreate in many games like Keyforge in different ways, where he's tried to be like, how can we actually create these like unique treasured objects that are personal and add this texture to the game in a way that is not possible to be replaced by this other system. And I think it's just really, really difficult.
I have had a somewhat cursed thought that has entered my brain every once in a while.
Was it to smash my face into the tabletop?
No, okay, I'm sorry I shared my intrusive
Sorry you
thought.
shared-
It's an intrusive thought, Anthony. I'm not going to do it. I would never hurt you, okay? It's the same kind of intrusive thought as like, what if I just put my hand in this garbage disposal? Like, I'm not going to do it, but you were just teed up in just the way that I was walking by you, and it would have been so easy just to pop your little head right on the counter.
Try not to tee up my face over the bar.
No, the cursed thought I'm describing is that, and I say it's a cursed thought because there's no way that the world in which we live could deliver this thing unto us in a non-abusable form. But the same way that a game like Minecraft is able to be generative within some range of expectations, right? All the biomes in Minecraft, all the sort of programming and art that has gone into making it so there are these generative landscapes where you can like just randomly go into some place, or you can put a seed in and go into whatever, and you are actually genuinely discovering new things that like no one has seen before and no one designed explicitly. Like no one said shape this cave just like this or make this mountain this exact, size.
Have a jungle biome intersect with a mountain biome, so you have this wild, hilly tree forest.
Right, no one designer like placed those blocks and said do this, but they created a system that allowed for this beautiful range. In that same way, I have often wondered if it would be possible to have a trading card game, a digital trading card game by nature, it would have to be digital, where all of the cards were generative within a similar set of rules, and you quite literally, were opening packs. Or I mean, honestly, you wouldn't open packs in this game. You would like, you know what is great? Have you ever watched anybody play Chandelar?
No. Is that the old Magic computer game?
Yes, it is an old Magic computer game, which is
where you're acquiring cards, so you're still playing with Magic cards, but there's also this extra video game component.
It's honestly an incredibly sick idea for a game. And obviously the implementation hasn't aged super well, but like it's a like role-playing game. You are a wizard, quite literally. You like walk around towns and you like go visit places and explore a world. And in the same way in like, Skyrim, you discover a sword and a rock. Instead, you discover magic cards. Like, you come across magic cards, you can buy them and trade them with, like, shopkeepers in the game, and you build a deck, and then when you get into combat with enemies, you play these short little micro games of Magic. Like, your life total might start at 5 or something. And I'm not actually sure what the rules are for how this, like, is determined, but you play these little micro games of Magic with a small deck and a small life total, and as the game goes on, you get more powerful cards, and, like, I've seen screenshots of people that are like playing and they have like a mono red deck that's got like 9 Mox rubies, and it's just an insane pile of cards because they've like maxed out this account. But the fundamental design of the game is so freaking cool that you are like exploring this world, and your Magic deck is how you engage with the world in both sets. It's how you engage with, enemies. It's how you engage with the resource system. It's just awesome. And all the like deck building restrictions are all gone. I'm not even sure if this was designed and built before there was like the 4-card limit and stuff like that, but it's just like a pile of cards you just do stuff with. What I want is a modern Chandelar where all the cards are generative, and you get to like go in and explore this world, and you could genuinely come across a card that is like just utterly broken, right? And it would be really hard to make a system that would allow for generative cards that had the same kind of beauty and depth that we see in the generative worlds of Minecraft. And I'm sure there are many other generative games out there that have a similar range of beauty to their generative assets. It would be so hard to make that, but that I think could, in theory, abstractly capture the thing that I think is the best about being new to Magic and playing at the kitchen table, where you would open a pack or, find a treasure chest, and you would actually be finding a new card that no one had ever maybe seen before. Such a cool idea.
Yes, and I'm sure we're going to get letters because I'm certain this exists. Like, there are a lot of games that operate in these like sort of parametric systems, and I think that you and I just don't necessarily seek these out. I mean, even Keyforge is, I believe, to a degree parametric, where there are certain parameters on the way the cards work, but the combinations of cards in decks is
my understanding of Keyforge is that like
created.
You can't. There's no deck construction. You like buy a deck.
You buy the deck,
and the deck is randomized, and so
correct.
The cards,
but it's randomized, but within parameters.
Right, of course. And obviously, I don't think any of the cards are generative in Keyforge. They've created the cards, and they have these parameters to randomly generate decks. But you could just buy a deck that happens to strike it rich and be like a much better deck.
That's where it's happened. Is like people are trading this is the one unique deck, but it has some powerful aspect to it. So again, it's like he's trying really hard to create a system that recreates what he loved about the pre-test Magic games, and it's just hard.
I mean, in the same way I was describing the fact that I think I had the most fun with Magic when I was not that invested, and it was so fun that of course I wanted to become more invested, right? Like that inherent tension. And I still love Magic, to be clear. Like, I'm not quite as jaded as you, and I think you still love Magic to some degree, but that inherent tension of like feeling myself get deeper into it, and also feeling as I got deeper, that light, that spark that I love so much, like get dimmer and dimmer and be like, there's just less of that thing I love here for me. That is kind of exactly the same arc that the actual game followed. It's like, here's this beautiful thing that we're playing in the UPenn library, and wow, more people should play this game. It's great. And exactly as more people play it and get invested in it, the game goes through the exact same arc of like, well, now, instead of just one person, learning all the cards that exist and kind of solving it for themselves and building all the decks they can think of, that's what everyone is doing. The metagame is evolving in the same way, and we're all kind of stuck in this web of like, the fundamental core thing is so great that we're all kind of engaged in like almost addictive behavior that is not actually...
No, we're fine.
No, but it's
we
like...
could stop.
But it's like, it's not actually... It's the same way that like, candy tastes so great to some people. I know not you, but to me it does. And you just want to eat it all the time, and then it's not good anymore, and you get unhealthy, and it doesn't... It's like this...
You've heard it here first. You eat candy and you get unhealthy. Not a medical
Sorry for
podcast.
being candy phobic. Yeah, no, it is very visceral to me, this like fundamental shift away from what makes Magic great towards it being this metagame. Like, metagaming just sucks, is what it comes down to. Whether you're locally metagaming, whether the game broadly has this metagame, like it is a whole different game to solve, and I think the competitive players that don't feel the kind of jaded you and I feel, it's because they care a lot about that game, and they're like, I want to be the one that breaks Modern wide open or figures out the exact combination of sideboard cards to bring to this tournament to show people up. And that is so far from what I could possibly be interested in about the game. But I think that the more you get invested, the sort of scales tip from you actually being invested with the core mechanics of the game, the thing that makes it great, the like kitchen table aspect of it, to the like metagame. And Cube is the one way we have. Hey, look, we said the word Cube, so
yeah, I was going to bring it up in 15 seconds if you didn't.
Well,
so.
you go.
I mean, I just think that, and Richard has actually said this. Somebody was asking in the Cube Talk Discord a couple weeks ago about, does Richard Garfield even know Cube exists? And he does. I wish I could re-find this quote, but again, it's impossible to find anything on the internet, where he was talking about the way that Magic has changed. And his original desire, this is more of just like an aesthetic and gameplay thing, was people are playing very different styles of decks, and one person might be all about summoning creatures to win, but somebody else was all about having magical baubles and using artifacts to win, and somebody else would be about summoning enchantments. And the game has just become about creatures so much, at the expense of variety to a large degree, I think. And then he sort of followed that up very lightly. It's like, but some people are still out there doing interesting things. Those Cube people are doing something interesting. And I was like, yes, Richard, you see it. And I think that Cube really does capture a lot of this, where, okay, if we make the meta game, the like, what cards are we playing? How are we collecting cards?
Cube resists metagaming in the sense I'm describing.
Well, metagaming in Richard Garfield's sense about the game about the game, it sort of becomes... It encourages some sort of conformity or like narrowing in optimization. Optimization is the best word probably. And Cube is this sort of like antithetical space where you are doing what Richard Garfield did in the early playtest cards of being the GM for a limited amount of Magic player experience. And you're saying, tonight, we're just playing with this subset of cards, and the fact that somebody opened this one card and gets to play with that for just tonight, and you don't have that card, and it's going to be really cool when you play against them and you see it, and it's like, oh my god, you assembled Tron? I didn't know that was even possible in this format. Cube really feels like a little microcosm where we are trying to recreate that pre-alpha experience.
I think many of us are, and it's what I want to do with Cube design.
I'm talking not so much about like the Magic Online Cube, which has its own merits. I'm definitely talking more about like when we get together and play in paper with cubes that somebody has designed, especially to do something that is a little bit novel.
I mean, I do think this is also a very clarifying way to describe two different schools of thought to what Cube is. And again, I think our side of that school is ascended a little bit, and the idea that Cube is like whatever you want it to be. It's a design exercise. But there's still a huge amount of people for whom Cube is an optimization. It is, we are just trying to find Magic's most powerful cards. And, you know, obviously we've talked about all the flaws in that like way of thinking, but they very much approach it like an optimization problem, not like a design challenge or a design opportunity. And so, I mean, I really wish this had come out before our last episode about novelty cubes, because the PDH pod, Pauper EDH podcast, one of the hosts of that show came across the 100 Ornithopters Cube, and they talked about it for like 10 minutes on one of the recent episodes, and someone shared it with me so I could listen to it.
Wow, you're famous.
Whatever. Which I loved their conversation about it.
Try to channel that big chat energy.
I loved their conversation about it because the guy who came across it apparently has a pre-existing obsession with ornithopters. He owns hundreds of them already.
Perfect.
Like exactly.
He's over there on TCG Player like, why is the price of Ornithopter just skyrocketing?
Get this. He's had a thing he's done for years where you can, if you're going to an event where Star City Games has a booth, you can email them or like place an order ahead of time and say like, hey, I bought these things on your website, bring them to the booth for me this weekend, right? You can basically hand deliver an order. And what he does every single time before an SCG event is buys out their full stock of, I think it's the M15 printing of Ornithopter, and says, bring them all to me. And he says he's done it so much that the people that work the booth know him as the Ornithopter guy. He's just been, every time he goes, he's like, oh, you have 40 of them? I'll buy 40 of them, whatever. Like, just buys them all.
So he doesn't even place a pre-order? They just are like, yeah, we'll set aside these Ornithopters. We know he'll be there.
No, he does place an order for them, but now he walks up and they don't have to say, what are you here for? They go, hey, we got your pile of Ornithopters for you.
Man, that's like... Have you ever been a regular at a bar or restaurant where they're just like, we got your order when you walk in?
Yeah.
I feel like we've actually talked about this on the podcast
it's
before.
So valuable to me. I have that right now, actually. A friend of mine and I go to Chuck's every Wednesday morning for breakfast,
a cool place.
to the point where they don't bother bringing us menus anymore. They just say the regular, and we say yes. And I love it. It's the best. We also had that for a little while, kind of, at Johnny Rad's when we lived a block away from. We lived a block away from this pizzeria and bar that we would go to a lot, like a couple times a week. I would say at least 4 times a month.
Accurate,
I would say
yeah.
Is it for like a whole year we went to this place, and they had enough of like staff turnover that I don't remember us being on like a first name basis with anybody or like not having to order. But it felt really nice to have like our spot where it was like, well, we know if we're going to go out to dinner, unless we're doing something out of the ordinary, we're going to here, and we know what we're going to get, and we have our favorite things.
So
I love that so much.
This guy's spot is Ornithopter.
Yeah. So anyway, that's just to say that, like, this guy, was wandering along, and I happened to accidentally, like, shoot him square between the eyes with, like, a thing that is exactly for him, right? And so he's, like, really into this idea, thinks it's really fascinating. He's trying to build the cube himself. He also, incidentally, lives in Maryland. I'm going to try and get him to come play with us in a couple weekends, just to play it first.
I mean, I feel like if you put the Ornithopter cube on the menu, that's going to tempt him, right?
Well, yeah, yes, to play the Ornithopter cube, not to play anything else, at least for the first time. But
sure.
I was talking about the range of responses to the Ornithopter Cube, and he has the most extreme version of one response, which is like, this is so cool and novel. This uses a card that like is iconic in Magic and I already have a relationship with, and it like recontextualizes it, and I think it's so cool. What are you laughing at?
I have a relationship with Ornithopter.
I mean, he does.
Yeah, absolutely.
But then one of the co-hosts was like the absolute furthest other end of the spectrum, and literally was like, this seems like garbage. I can't imagine this is fun more than once, if it even is fun once. And then he said on the show, and I truly love this. If you happen to listen to this, I'm not upset at all. I think it's amazing. He said, how did this guy make a cube with 100 ornithopters and not put Raid Bombardment in it? He didn't even say guy. He said, how did this idiot make a cube with 100 ornithopters and not put Raid Bombardment in it? And like, it just kind of, tears the list apart a little bit on the show, which I think was very funny. But I wish I had that clip for this. But in that clip, it was also, these people mainly play Pauper EDH, right? That's their main format.
So wait, why didn't you put Raid Bombardment in? I'm sure you looked at all the cards.
It's in the maybe board. It's been there for a while.
Okay.
It's worse than Cavalcade of Calamity in this
So
list.
listeners, check the maybe board before you tear a cube list apart.
Well, that's part of why I found it funny. Maybe I wouldn't have found it funny if I hadn't heard of Raid Bombardment and thought I actually was
You
an
would have
idiot.
been like, I am an
But
idiot.
actually, I'm
Shoot.
like, I knew all of that already, and so it's funny to me that you're thinking I didn't think of that.
Wow.
But they also talked just a little bit about Cube in general, and it's clear that they're not deep in the Cube community. Like, it's a thing they're aware of in the periphery. And, they said that, like, oh, the Cube's not powered, because that's one of the main distinctions for them, is, like, a Cube powered or not.
That
and
is
like,
very funny to me.
And they say on the show, like, cubes can be good when they're not powered. Like, they defend the idea that an unpowered cube could be good.
Those 9 cards aren't absolutely critical to a fun experience.
So they describe some other person who's in their playgroup but not on the show, who's not off mic, that is like, why does this cube have power in it? Like, their idea is just like, a cube is about optimizing. Why do you not have Black Lotus in the Ornithopter Cube? And it was a nice little gentle reminder of how much you and I are in a filter bubble. We're in a tiny little space where we talk to the same people all the time that listen to this show, that are like, friends and like peers of ours. In the broader Magic world, I think Cube is largely still about optimization. There's powered cubes and there's unpowered cubes. I mean, they said a couple times, it's a vintage cube. It's like vintage legality. It's like, that is not what it doesn't matter.
We're so far beyond that.
Like, first of all, I have Echoing Boon in there. It's not vintage legality. It's illegal in vintage. You cannot play this card in vintage. So,
right.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear like how focused they were on the rarity, how they mentioned a couple times it wasn't powered. Like, their lens was just totally different than ours, and not in any kind of judgmental way. It was just like,
that's so funny to me to look at this cube that is absolutely bizarre and just be like, well, does this fit into my 2 categories I know? And it's like, this is so far outside of those categories.
Yeah, I love that it's not vintage legal. Like, it's not a vintage cube. It's too powerful. You can't play it in vintage. Anyway, we got like 2 paragraphs left here. Let's close this out and then get any last thoughts you have.
It's gonna get weird.
About a year after Magic debuted, Sandra Everingham visited Turnhout, Belgium, a quaint cobblestoned Flemish village where the cards were printed at the time. There she toured the factory floor and clean rooms of Cardamundi, the world's largest producer of board and card games, whose printing presses strained to keep up with the demand for more Magic cards. I got to see the machinery that sorted out the cards into their booster packs, which Cardamundi had custom built for us. Thousands and thousands of packs. 24-hour printing shifts at times. The volume was staggering, she said. After they left the factory, one of the company's sales representatives pointed out a building in the city's Old Town, which looked like something you might explore in a Dungeons & Dragons campaign. You know what that is? Everingham remembered the sales rep asking. That's our prison. We send all the flattened Magic packaging and booster packs to the prison, and the inmates do the product fulfillment. Excuse me?
And on that bombshell.
Wait, hold on. Record scratch.
This is a very interesting sort of turn at the end of this article.
When the rep says that's our prison, does he mean
the town's prison?
Literally, that is
not Cardamundi's prison, the town's prison.
Well, he could. I mean, my first read of it was like, that is our prison in the sense that, like, oh, that's a building we own where we do tasks that people don't like, and we call it our prison. The same way you would call like some thankless task at your job, like, the prison thing.
No, I think they're saying literally they were making license plates. The prisoners were packing the Magic cards.
What? That's almost too poetic.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a weird little afterthought. It's like kind of disconnected from the rest of this, but I feel like the author is just really trying to emphasize that Magic exists in a broader economic system that has been flawed from the beginning. And it's like, as much as we gripe about the way that Magic has changed and Hasbro's doing this and that, it's always been complicated and ethically difficult.
Turns out.
I don't think we have time to get into the entire prison system and how messed up that is, but we could.
Save that for the Patreon feed in 4 years. Well, this concludes our first reading series episode of the show. Let us know if this is an interesting format for people. My idea here, theoretically, is that I hope, obviously, the commentary is interesting, and it's like additional angle on this. If you already read the article, and then you still listen to this whole episode, was it too repetitive? Was it still interesting for you? Also, I kind of hope that for some people, this does a small good of turning this article into audio for blind people or other folks that just can't read on the internet. It's like an accessibility thing. So let us know if that works, and we might do more in the future. But it's gone a little long. It's a long article, so we'll just wrap it up there. Oh, I do want to say, the day this episode comes out, shout out to our friends over at UberCube. They are releasing their 100th episode today. Huge milestone for them.
Hey, congrats.
In some ways, weirdly, I feel older because UberCube is putting out their 100th episode than I did when we put out our 200th. It's like, I don't feel old when I think of my own age. I feel old when I look at my nieces and nephews, and I'm like, you're in college now? Not to that
what
sounds,
are you saying about
that sounds? I mean, I just mean they're literally younger than us in terms of the how long the podcast has been around.
Is younger, yes.
Yeah, that sounds weirdly infantilizing.
It does.
No disrespect to UberCube. And the folks over at Squares.Cube have also passed a lot of early milestones in their downloads, so shout out to them. Go check out Squares.Cube if you haven't. They've been doing a lot of great episodes with community members and interviews and stuff that I've never gotten off my butt to organize. So definitely check out Squares.Cube as another great Cube podcast.
Yeah,
if
I really
you haven't
enjoyed the episodes with Bones, who is just a awesome community guy.
Community guy.
He's an awesome judge and also has just designed a lot of really interesting cubes. And another episode with Deinonychus recently.
Yeah, so check out those for sure, and all the other episodes of Squares.Cube. Shouts outs to the community. Now we're really done.
Thanks to all the prison employees who packed the magic cards.
Yeah, thanks to all those inmates in the Flemish jail that packed early magic cards. Anyway, all of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This article is produced by Nick Zarzicki. So thanks, Nick, for writing this article. This podcast is produced by reading the article out loud and then weighing in on it into microphones. I shouldn't try and change up the end thing.
No.
It really just kind of goes off the rails when I do. Anyway, thanks for doing this, Anthony.
What if we can get Richard Garfield on the podcast?
I think we could.
We'd have to block out some extra time because he'd be late and then he'd go off on lots of tangents.
Right, which would be
great.
That'd be the feature. We just have to design for that.
Feature, not bug.
Yeah.